The morning sun stretched across the presidential compound in Ouagadougou as Captain Ibrahim Traoré reviewed maps of new projects. His aide entered nervously with an envelope sealed by the International Judicial Summit. At just 34, the young president had turned Burkina Faso into a symbol of African independence, yet the invitation carried weight beyond ceremony. He was asked to speak in Washington, D.C., on democratic leadership alongside Justice Clarence Thomas, a pairing meant as provocation. His ministers warned it was a trap, but Traoré saw an opening to confront power on its own stage. His security chief, a veteran of past struggles, cautioned against leaving African soil. Still, as he looked out at children playing in the courtyard, he thought of Sankara and chose to accept. That night, beneath Ouagadougou's call to prayer, he drafted his reply, measured, resolute, and entirely his own. Weeks later, his plane descended into Washington's gray October sky, carrying more than one man. It bore the hopes of a continent. The modest reception at Andrews Air Force Base contrasted with the grandeur of American monuments rising below. His convoy slipped quietly toward the summit hall, passing pedestrians and headlines doubting why an African youth had been invited at all. Through the tinted glass, Traoré studied a city that proclaimed freedom while his own homeland had long endured plunder. Knowing the words he carried would test that contradiction, the Washington monument rose into the clouds like a stern finger aimed at heaven as president. Traoré entered the Grand Hyatt. Diplomats whispered in tight circles, their polished suits gleaming under crystal chandeliers. Near the fountain, Justice Clarence Thomas commanded a crowd with talk of judicial restraint, his comfort in contrast to the outsider now striding across marble floors. Staff moved with quiet precision, but their eyes followed the young African president whose presence unsettled the room. When the elevator doors shut behind him, it felt like the beginning of a play history had waited to stage. In his room, high above the city, Traoré reviewed his speech. It wasn't the diplomatic pleasantries they expected, but a direct challenge about dignity and sovereignty. Beyond the glass, the Potomac flowed toward the ocean that once carried ships of bondage. Messages buzzed in from Ouagadougou, where citizens clung to radios. 2 hours remained before the summit. He adjusted his simple fatigues, knowing truth would be his only armor. At the Kennedy Center, anticipation swelled beneath towering chandeliers. 50 nations looked on as Thomas, dressed in a tailored Navy suit, settled into the stage with the confidence of a man never seriously opposed. The moderator's introduction dripped with bias, praising Thomas as a pillar of wisdom before reducing Traoré's presence to a footnote. Cameras tightened their focus, prepared for his humiliation. Thomas began smoothly declaring that young leaders confuse revolution with governance. His gaze locked on Traoré as he warned against the dangers of populist movements. Applause followed like ritual affirmation. Then the moderator turned, her patronizing smile loaded with skepticism. "President Traoré, how do you answer critics who call your revolution destabilizing?" The audience leaned forward, certain they were about to watch the outsider stumble. Even the lighting seemed designed to favor Thomas, leaving Traoré half in shadow as he rose with deliberate calm. His olive fatigue stood in stark defiance against the polished suits around him. The room hushed, tension sharp enough to cut glass. Thomas's smile wavered. The moderator shifted uneasily. When Traoré spoke, his voice sliced the silence, measured, burning with restrained fire. "You speak of respect for institutions built on our ancestors' backs." The words landed like strikes, exposing hypocrisies long ignored. He stepped to the microphone, eyes locked on Thomas. "You lecture Africa on stability, while your own court strips rights from your people." A ripple moved through the audience. He pressed on, his cadence steady but searing. "For 4 centuries, Africa has been told to honor the very structures that enslaved and exploited us. You wear the robes of justice while practicing oppression." Delegates shifted, cameras scrambled, and Thomas froze. Caught in the line of fire, attempting to retake control, Thomas began, "Young man, you don't understand American jurisprudence." But Traoré cut him off without hesitation. "I understand perfectly. In Burkina Faso, we call you a house slave with a Harvard degree." Gasps exploded across the hall. You eat at their table and call it justice while your people suffer. Thomas flushed, the moderator paralyzed as her script collapsed. Traore's closing words landed like a verdict. Africa doesn't need lectures from someone who's forgotten where he came from. Silence thundered through the chamber. In those moments, the balance of power inverted. Thomas sat diminished, his authority shattered. Traore stood tall, adjusting his uniform with quiet finality. Camera flashes lit the hall as journalists captured history. A setup meant to humiliate had birthed something larger, a seismic shift where truth broke centuries of silence, and the Kennedy Center shook like a long, dormant volcano awakening. The silence broke in an instant, replaced by thunderous applause. African diplomats were first to rise, pride radiating from their faces as they clapped with force that shook the hall. Young aides followed, then entire rows of observers, the ovation spreading like fire. Even a few Europeans joined, unable to resist the raw power of Traore's words. The sound swelled until it became a roar, 5 minutes of relentless approval that left Thomas stranded in humiliation. Phones lit up across the audience, recording a scene already destined to circle the globe. Tears streamed down the face of a young Ghanaian diplomat as she filmed, whispering that her children would one day watch this moment. From the balcony, African-American law students began chanting, "Truth, truth, truth," their voices echoing over the claps. The moderator tried to restore order, but her voice was drowned beneath the surge of liberation filling the Kennedy Center. Thomas rose unsteadily, only to be trapped by applause that blocked his escape. He sank back into his chair, his reputation broken by half a minute of African defiance. Traore stood calmly at center stage, his olive uniform stark against the glittering chandeliers, his quiet poise louder than any shout. The revolution had come not with weapons, but with words, unflinching and undeniable. Backstage, panic rippled through organizers. Thomas stormed toward a private room, the moderator chasing after him in vain. His colleagues waited, stunned as he passed in silence, his composure shattered. Meanwhile, in the African lounge, celebrations swelled. Ambassadors embraced him, phones buzzed with urgent calls, and a veteran diplomat whispered that was 4 centuries of dignity finally speaking. Traore remained composed, absorbing the moment with a soldier's discipline. Around him, advisors mapped exits and strategists spoke of the future. Outside, protesters already gathered, summoned by viral clips of the confrontation. Inside, a hotel suite had turned into a command post, where Africa's diplomatic future was being redrawn in real time. In Thomas's private suite, the air was thick with panic. He sat slumped, muttering, "He ambushed me," as if repetition could soften the blow. His wife paced furiously, while think tank operatives sketched strategies to contain what they were already calling the DC debacle. Cigar smoke curled as Republican donors demanded explanations, furious that their champion had faltered so publicly. Phone lines burned with calls from Fox News, conservative radio, and damage control specialists, each one scrambling to frame the humiliation as anything but defeat. Legal scholars whispered about his legacy, fearing the confrontation would stain it forever. Across town, Traore's team worked with African media to ensure his words reached the continent unfiltered. Headlines from Cairo to Cape Town roared with pride, dignity restored, the lion roars in Washington. Social media detonated within half an hour. A single clip of his fiery rebuttal, broadcast first by CNN's own cameras, spiraled across TikTok, Twitter, and Instagram, racking up millions of views under the hashtag Nostra Destroys. Clarence. European networks fumbled at first, calling it a diplomatic incident, before public demand forced honesty. Al Jazeera praised the dismantling of Western hypocrisy, their segment itself going viral. By nightfall, translations carried Traore's voice into dozens of languages, echoing in places that had never heard Africa speak with such clarity. American conservatives rushed into crisis mode. Fox anchors insisted Thomas had been blindsided by radical rhetoric. Talk radio hosts branded Traore unstable and dangerous, while the Wall Street Journal defended Thomas with op-eds, attacking the African president's credentials. Think tanks pushed surrogates onto cable panels, straining to minimize the encounter's meaning. But the damage was irreversible. What began as a staged ambush had ignited into a global reckoning, and everyone in Washington understood. The rules had changed. Their efforts grew frantic as the clip spread faster with every share. Algorithms pushed it onto millions of screens, stripping old media of control. Capitals across the globe reacted as the shockwave registered. The African Union hailed Traoré for defending the continent's dignity. Macron's office stayed silent, wounded by France's recent losses in West Africa. China highlighted the exchange as proof of America's declining moral authority, while Latin American leaders, though cautious in public, quietly nodded in recognition of their own struggles. Scholars rushed to convene conferences, already calling it a turning point in North-South relations. What began in a hall at the Kennedy Center had become a worldwide symbol of resistance to intellectual colonialism. By midnight, the confrontation had racked up more than 100 million views, one of the most watched political moments of the decade. Students from Harvard to Howard and across African universities from Accra to Cape Town replayed Traoré's words in packed dormitories, debating sovereignty and independence late into the night. Diaspora communities flooded streets and cafes with celebration, chanting that Africa had spoken without apology at last. Conservative spin was powerless against the raw footage, which carried its own authority. In Washington, Traoré's hotel phone rang endlessly with interview requests from networks that had once ignored him. Meanwhile, Justice Thomas fled to his Virginia home, avoiding cameras as his legacy faced an interrogation unlike any he had known. The storm Traoré unleashed promised to redefine political discourse for years. On the University of Ghana campus, a young political science student watched the clip again and again, whispering, "Finally, someone who speaks for us." Across the continent, classrooms turned into forums of pride and resolve, as students organized solidarity rallies and debated what a truly independent Africa could look like. The ripple spread into Europe. In London's financial district, African professionals gathered in pubs, their screens glowing with the clip. A Kenyan banker admitted to a colleague, "I've been apologizing for who I am my entire career." By night's end, WhatsApp groups formed across Paris, Berlin, and Amsterdam, connecting Africans in business and academia who had long hidden parts of themselves. For the diaspora, it was a reawakening. In the United States, black intellectuals entered their own debates about identity and authenticity. At Spelman College, Professor Maria Johnson rewrote her syllabus overnight, framing the confrontation as a case study in post-colonial thought. Her students came early to class, eager to unpack what it meant for Africa and for themselves, when truth was spoken so boldly on the world stage. This is what dignity looks like when it refuses to compromise, Professor Johnson told her packed classroom. Across America, churches wove the moment into sermons about facing oppression with both grace and strength. Families replayed the clip at gatherings, grandparents linking it to their own struggles with racism. A younger generation of black Americans began questioning whether integration had too often meant assimilation. In corporate towers from Wall Street to Silicon Valley, the exchange shifted conversations. Executives spoke of African markets with new respect. The viral moment humanized a continent long reduced to stereotypes, revealing intellectual leadership the world could not ignore. Investment firms scrambled to recruit African analysts. Tech companies sought partnerships with universities in Nairobi, Lagos, and Accra, realizing they had underestimated Africa's innovative power. Even hardened capitalists recognized that old assumptions no longer held. Development organizations, once confident in their paternalistic models, faced uncomfortable scrutiny in half a minute. Traoré had done for African dignity what decades of cautious diplomacy had failed to achieve. That night, in his hotel suite overlooking the Potomac, the weight of history settled on his shoulders. Phones had finally stopped ringing under a security-enforced blackout. Through the window, Washington's lights glimmered, symbols of powers that had long pressed on Africa. His uniform, draped on a chair, still carried the scent of the Kennedy Center's marble halls. He knew there was no retreat from the words he had spoken. Messages poured in from African leaders praising his courage, but he understood the real test had only begun. The confrontation wasn't about Justice Thomas alone. It was about dismantling the mindset that let intellectual colonialism thrive unchecked. His thoughts drifted home to the children in Ouagadougou's classrooms who would inherit the meaning of this moment. The stage had been theater. Sovereignty would be built in schools, hospitals, and infrastructure projects. A knock interrupted him. His foreign minister entered with intelligence briefings. "Captain, Western media is trying to paint you as unstable, but their own footage proves otherwise," she said. Traore nodded, knowing that symbolic victory must now be translated into structural change. Later, a video call with his cabinet brought the reality closer. Ministers reported that markets had stayed open late, crowds gathering around radios to discuss the encounter like a championship match. Children in schoolyards mimicked his words, their voices carrying the rhythm of defiance. Farmers in distant villages listened to the replay on community radios, their faces lit with recognition. "For the first time, they see one of us speaking to the world as an equal," his interior minister said. Traore smiled. This was the real victory, not headlines or hashtags, but a continent rediscovering its voice. No longer whispering, but speaking with unflinching clarity. As midnight drew near, he began drafting remarks for tomorrow's press conference. The media would press for apologies and softened tones. He would give them none. His revolution had always been rooted in authenticity over acceptability, truth over comfort, dignity over diplomacy. The young captain, who had cast off French neo-colonialism at home, was now challenging it before the world. Tomorrow promised new battles, but tonight he allowed himself a moment of stillness. Through the window, the Washington Monument glowed pale against the night sky, a monument to power built on contradictions. Africa's voice had finally thundered through the same halls where its fate had been decided for centuries, and the echo would not fade when he returned to the red earth of home. 6 months after the Kennedy Center confrontation, Ibrahim Traoré stood before the newly completed Continental Parliament in Addis Ababa, addressing the largest gathering of African leaders in modern history. The flags of all 54 nations framed the simple podium, each cloth representing a people who had rediscovered their voice in the wake of Washington. His words cut like steel. "We are no longer asking for seats at their table. We are building our own." The parliament building itself, financed entirely with African resources and built by African engineers, stood as a testament to the dignity he had defended. Leaders who once measured themselves by Western approval now spoke with the assurance of people who remembered their worth. What began with Justice Thomas had become the spark for Africa's most profound transformation since independence. In that chamber, surrounded by ancestral echoes, the continent was rewriting its relationship with the world. Universities made the Traoré Doctrine required study, teaching how authentic leadership could reshape global discourse. New schools of diplomacy trained future leaders to prize dignity over accommodation, truth over expediency. The African Union's budget tripled as funds once funneled to Western institutions were redirected into continental development. Trade between African nations flourished, and new infrastructure linked capitals that had long relied on European intermediaries. The clip of Traoré's defiant response played in classrooms from primary schools to doctoral programs, teaching children that their voices mattered. Justice Thomas became unintentionally the symbol of what Africa was leaving behind. Beyond Africa, the impact spread. Latin American leaders adopted similar stances against condescension. Asian nations embraced authenticity over submission, and global financial institutions faced unprecedented demands for equity. Europe scrambled to salvage relationships, while US think tanks issued urgent reports on managing Africa's awakening as their old leverage dissolved. What began as a 32-second clash had swelled into a worldwide movement for post-colonial authenticity. When Traoré ended his speech in Addis, delegates erupted in applause, their cheers echoing the Kennedy Center moment months earlier. His closing words resonated like prophecy. That moment in Washington was not about destroying one man. It was about Africa remembering who she has always been. The young captain who spoke truth to power had become the catalyst for psychological independence. His name joined the pantheon of Mandela, Sankara and Lumumba, leaders who refused to bargain their people's dignity. The attempted ambush in Washington had become Africa's declaration of intellectual sovereignty. Historians would mark it as the moment Africa stopped explaining itself and began defining itself. The legacy was not the ruin of Clarence Thomas, but the rebirth of a continent speaking with the voice of its ancestors. Ibrahim Traoré's 30-second response did more than silence a justice. It awakened a continent and reminded the world that Africa's dignity is non-negotiable.